just a few words about archaeology as a form of inquiry, as a form of inquiry that can help in grasping the epistemic dimension of the processes of governing. As you have seen, I have used sometimes the word discourse, and sometimes I've been referring to the idea of discursive practices. I have a slide on this later on, but I want to focus to make clear since now that this is not an attempt in any way to identify a unity, a totality, a coherent formation. Discourses in Foucault work becomes many things, you know, and there is the nice thing about the quotations that he is very conscious about this in the archaeology of knowledge. But, you know, here the idea when I employ the word discourse is to attempt to trace, to map systems of emergence of objects, systems of appearance and distribution of enunciative modes, and I will be clear about what this means later. System of placing and dispersion of concept. You know, there is dispersion, heterogeneity, there is difference within this. So discourses are problematic unities. But the idea is, you know, to welcome this kind of inquiry in order to approach discursive practices as something which is not a self-evident reality, you know, and relate this to the quotation from what is enlightenment that I showed you before. And so, you know, discourse is a very fluctuating, a word with a very fluctuating meaning, as I was saying. And in fact, when in the way I'm trying to employ archaeology, what is at the center, you know, of the analytical strategy is not so much discourse as a unity, right? But, you know, what Foucault called the statement. What I will try to do later on, coming back on the picture we have discussed at the beginning, is to try to grasp to what extent we can interpret them as statements. We can look for statements in that ways of in that discursive practices. And here, the basic idea when Foucault defined the statement, you know, the statement is not something which is simply said, you know. It is not a sentence, it is not a word. The statement in Foucault language is a function. It is not a structure, it is a function of existence, you know, which relates, as you can see from the quotes, you know, it is what creates the possibility for the discursive practices you can observe to make sense. You know, it is related to what role the discursive practices follow one another or are juxtaposed, what are the signs, and what sort of act is carried out by their formulation. It is important that you get this point quite clear, you know. And of course, it is interesting because, you know, a statement can cut across a domain of structures and possible unities. And it is something that we have to describe in its acts of practice, its condition, the rules that govern it, and the field in which it operates. You know? Is it clear? Yes? Okay. You know, it's somehow difficult to talk about this even for me because I'm working on this. And so another interesting thing that Foucault says is that, you know, the statement is linked to a referentials. That is made up not of things, facts, reality, or beings, but laws of possibility and rules of existence. For what? For the objects that are named, make visible, designated, described within it. And for the relation that are affirmed or denied within it. So you see, analyzing the discursive practices in terms of what are the statements we are confronting with means to think about which are the laws of possibility for that practice, which are the rule of existence for the emergence of, for a distinct set of objects on the surface of that practice. Objects that are named, designated, described, and which are put in relation with other subjects. The discourse in Foucault terms is a set of generative relations, rules of formation of relations, and of course denied. And it is, in the grasping of these laws of possibilities and rules of existence, according to Foucault, that is possible to grasp how and to what extent, that discursive practices are accorded a value as a truth. This is what Foucault means when he says, I'm trying to analyze regimes of truth, how truth is made. And very provisionally, again, later on, I will try to, to come back to that statement in order to understand, at least in part, what are the laws of possibility, what are the rules of existence of that statement. If you look at the archaeology of knowledge, in the first section of the book, Foucault says, if you want to analyze discursive formations, we have to look at 4 distinct processes of formation: objects, enunciative modalities, concepts, and strategies. And I will briefly go through the first 3 of them: objects, enunciative modalities, and concepts. And I want to clarify, since now that what I'm focusing on is the process of concept formation. In the first case, the idea is to identify the rules of formation from which the appearance of specific objects and the possibility of a juxtaposition, composition, succession between different objects depend. And here Foucault says you have to explore the relation between the surfaces of emergence, the institutional disciplinary surfacing on which specific kind of objects emerge and are made nameable, describable, analyzable, and so on. You have to grasp relationally the authorities of the limitation. What are the authoritative voice that are enabled to talk about these objects, and the grids of specification, how these objects are placed, divided, classified, combined within them, put in relation. You have to look at the processes of the formation of enunciative modalities, how discourses produce subjectivities and subject position. And this means to identify who are the subjects who have the authority to use a distinct specific language. And this is something I think you are familiar with. You have to analyze which are the status of these subjects, their institutional position, where their authority comes from, and so on. You have to analyze the institutional position from which these subjects speak the discourse. But in our case, I think the most interesting part of the grid is the one that relates to concepts. Here, Foucault says, in analyzing the concept formation, the idea is to describe the organization of the field of statements in which concepts emerge and circulate. And he says there are, forms of succession, forms of coexistence, and procedures of intervention. And here I want to be very clear on, the form of coexistence, because it is something that I'm focusing. This is what I'm focusing here. When he says, when he talks about form of succession, he says there are different modalities of dispersion of series of statements, and he is thinking about schemes of dependence, the operation through which it is established a dependence between one concept and another. Ordering creates a series, a succession. There are forms of coexistence, and when it comes to the forms of coexistence, he says there are three different spaces, surfaces, fields. There is a field of presence, that comprises all the statements that are accepted by discourse as truth and those who are denied truth. So the idea is how is constituted the field of presence, within this problematic unity that we are calling discourse. The second one is a field of concomitance. And he says there is an ensemble of statements that concern different objects and belong to different discourses, but exert a function in relation to the statement in focus, acting as points of analogy, general principle, accepted premises, transferable models, imperatives. Here you have the idea that discourse is not something like a closed unity, but there are statements that works across. And through processes that can be processes of analogy, statements that can act as general principles, premises, models that are transferable. As you will see later, I will try to make sense of that discursive practices, basically in terms of concept transference, from different epistemological subspaces. And there is a field of memory. Foucault says that is a field where it is possible to recognize statements that are no longer accepted but have been seen as precursors. This is another interesting thing to say. And of course there are, when we come to analyze the formation of concepts, there are procedures of interventions, which means legitimate modes of intervening on statements, translating, make them systematic processes of systematization, redefinition, rewriting.